Thank you, everyone. Just a little bit more about me. I actually spent a good portion of my career in the insurance industry. Do I have anyone in the room that's from the insurance industry? It's the industry where I fell in love with data because honestly, it's the only industry, all it has is data. And it's how we make our business decisions. And honestly, it was the industry that was using data before data was cool. So it's been around for centuries, let's put it that way. So I really want to talk about, we're in the age of AI, machine learning, whatever your definition is. I personally like to use the term augmented intelligence as opposed to artificial intelligence. But again, it depends upon your organization. But I think the key element behind it is people are going, can I actually trust my data? And will my data be able to allow me to take advantage of the technical capabilities? So a couple of different elements that are in the news. And I know earlier I heard ChatGPT mentioned by a few folks. But before ChatGPT, 96% of most AI initiatives focused on efficiency improvements inside a business unit rather than looking at things enterprise-wide. This is coming from a recent Gartner survey. But I think what's even more important is IDC also has a survey to talk about rethinking your data. But less than a third of data within an organization is actually used, which basically means we're not using 2/3 of our data. That could be good, that could be bad. So on that, the other aspect is if you look at a recent analysis by McKinsey, is the potential impact of AI is over $25 trillion on the global economy. I don't know if that's exaggerated or hallucinated. If I use ChatGPT, it might have told me a hallucinated number. I don't know. But I will look at least sourcing McKinsey. But advanced analytics, a large number. And the opportunity in the market is AI can have an impact on our companies and on our society. But I think let's take a step back. If we want to be able to take advantage of those opportunities, equally, there's a number of stories or research or all of us experiencing within our own enterprises challenges to the adoption or actually to the success of our data and analytics initiatives. Data quality, this is actually coming from a Gartner study. Almost $13 million on average across the globe for every company is costing to the bottom line of the company. Also looking at very few machine learning models are actually deployed. Saw a recent survey, roughly 35% actually make it to production. Why is that? Sometimes it's the business case is not there. People don't trust their data to take the model to production. And also, not everything is a model. We can actually use data to help us just investigate, to explore. But I think the other aspect is sometimes we're using technology for technology's sake. We're not using it to understand how we can actually have an impact to our business. And I'll just give you some context of how I think about kind of like the enterprise AI. And I'm gonna lay the technology foundation first. Many times people go, do I have the right technology? Do I have the right investments in the infrastructure? We hear people going, I'm gonna do this in the cloud, I'm gonna do it on-prem. Honestly, from a business perspective, I could care less where it's done. Just make sure that it's cost effective and it's efficient for me as a business. The other aspect is leveraging different types of platforms. We're seeing more and more usage of open source technology with more defined data services. So we're looking at that capability. We're also seeing within Gen AI the usage of foundational models. Using that to develop generative AI apps. or just maybe your own apps, however you want to refer to it as. Also, the emergence of more and more models, and also for us within our own respective businesses, how do we take advantage of those models, but also use them in the context of our own enterprise, of our own business, in our own industry? And then lastly, making sure that those services are there so as an end user, from a business perspective, we can actually leverage that. The one thing, though, from an enterprise AI importance is governance, explainability, and the safety of data. And then also within that is data quality. How do I discover data? And also data security. And what I find interesting is the top part of this chart constantly changes. But as an organization, are we addressing some of the reasons why some of the technology investments may not get taken to the bottom line? Because we continue to have data governance issues, we have data quality issues that we really need to address. And I think fundamentally in organizations is how do we ensure when we embark on any form of data analytics, how do we ensure that we get the business value out of our investments, looking at governance, looking at data quality, and making sure that they're equally understood as part of our process. So given that I used to be, I would say I'm a recovering accountant. I used to be a CFO of an insurance company. So I'm going to ask in the audience, in your organization, how many classify your data as an asset to the business? In today's world, we have so many new dimensions. In fact, I saw an article yesterday that rather than referring to it as an asset or a liability, it's also, is data providing a dividend to the business? Are we being able to, get profitable growth? Are we leveraging data efficiently and effectively? And I posed this question to some colleagues that I work with. Sometimes when you think about the mistakes that we maybe make with lack of quality or not being able to trust our data, how should we account for that? And does data governance and trustworthiness of data get enough exposure? Should we maybe be reflecting it as a line item on our profit and loss statement? Because if it's an asset, it's hopefully allowing us to generate revenue or reduce expenses. But the other aspect is, if we're making bad business decisions, it's definitely impacting our ability to make and get the business value out of our data investments. So what's the role of data governance in enterprise AI? I personally believe it's more important than ever. I go back to my days being a CFO, and my chief actuary and we constantly argued whose numbers were right. And I'm like, why is that? Talk to IT. We had 13 copies of our policy in force. And I go, no wonder we can't both come to the same answer. Which version are you using versus what version am I using? So the role of data governance, and I'll ask, how many people in the room feel like they have a solid data governance practice? So data governance is really helping us to understand the origin of data, the quality, the sensitivity, and the life cycle of all data we use. It also helps us with streamlining how are we actually acquiring data? How are we actually managing the data? Am I getting it from a source that's trusted? Or as I actually start to combine data, can I still trust that data? My opinion, it's foundational for anything that we do moving forward. And I also believe it's, in today's world, it also, having solid governance is going to be able to mitigate some of our enterprise risks within the organizations. And it's no longer about, is my data trustworthy? We have to think about, is my data honest, harmless, and helpful? And that is kind of a different thought process, because what we're seeing from a Gen AI perspective is data can hallucinate, or the processes that we're using causes hallucination. causes me to also maybe have toxic data within my environment. So governance is more critical than ever. And so on that, I'm just going to talk a little bit because I have a tendency to work in a couple of organizations, one that's called For Humanity, and it's about how are we leveraging data in our enterprises. So if you think about the different types of maturity frameworks, we can look at ad hoc processes. Maybe I have organized and repeatable processes, managed and sustainable, optimized and innovative. So I've got some key elements of what I'm seeing and how I would define the business processes here. So a lot of organizations, I think, are still in that left-hand side of ad hoc and organized and maybe repeatable. And we're seeing pockets of organizations say, rather than going, can I do this? Should I do this? You start to see internal groups being advocates for how are we actually leveraging data. We may have ad hoc reviews on how are we doing this. I'll call this the woke teams, those that are aware of what data and the implications that data can do. And specifically now with Gen AI, the processes that are around how do I detoxify maybe harmful language that might be in foundational models, and even our own internal data. So how do I make sure that I'm looking for, is this data going to impact either my business, impact society? Because a lot of times, data can be for good, but data can also be for bad. And there's enough bad actors in the world already, but this is also the ability that we've got to get some of these things under control. And I think some of the things that we're seeing from a Gen AI perspective, we have to be thinking about those things, even if you have an ad hoc process today. Start to embed those things into how you're looking at data. From an organized and repeatable perspective, typically we see organizations that have executive buy-in. We've established ethical guidelines and principles. We also are building more diversity in our teams, people that are bringing different perspectives. Because if I get the same type of people in my data science team looking at data without bringing in business experts or industry knowledge or just a different perspective, I can end up with bias in my models, and also leading to some elements of not being ethical or not being responsible. The other aspect is, how do we think about education? And it's not just in our data science teams. It's not within IT. It's within the business as well. And we're also starting to see some organizations, and I've seen this with an organization called For Humanity that's actually in Europe, and then it's really kind of a groundswell of people across the world that are developing a review process. And it's also starting to see some of this come from the regulators. And we're embedding those processes in our actual model development. The other aspect is, as we continue to evolve, is how do we make sure that we're thinking about these things earlier rather than later? And maybe is that why the model didn't go into production? So thinking about that as we move forward. Also making sure that we either look at our potential bias assessments. There's organizations that are out there that are giving you mitigation tools or just a third party data. And the other aspect is, how do we track, how do we monitor? Are we performing audits on our models? And then lastly, and I think this will continue to evolve as time goes on, but how do we actually bring in additional types of reviews, privacy, accessibility, legal, and making sure that we don't end up with ethical debt. And that ethical debt means the reputation of using certain types of data within our enterprise. So fundamentally, as we're thinking about how has trust, the aspect of what we used to think about, can I use this data to make a trusted or an educated business decision? Now it's with the different data and analytics capabilities, should I really be doing this? And then also, how do we possibly use this framework to say, we're just gonna block the launch of this? But hopefully, throughout time, we don't end up at that last step where we're making those decisions earlier in the process. So let's move on to a little bit about how do we find value in our AI initiatives or even our data initiatives. I'm sure everybody in the room has some type of business framework that you're using, but I still find organizations that I know I have the opportunity to talk to as I go, why are you doing this? And it's not just technology for technology's sake. We have to be thinking about what business, we used to say if you're going to do a data initiative, what questions am I going to answer? The other aspect is what business challenges, what pains do we have? What are those problems? And then also linking that back to what's the outcome? What are the business benefits? Because from an IT perspective, and I don't classify myself as an IT person, I classify myself as probably somebody that sits in between. Too many times I see us go straight to the solution. I swear I'm in a room and people are coding before they even sit down at the table. And I'm like, but that's not the problem we're trying to solve. So how do we think about the business value up front in our data and analytics initiatives? Understand why. Is there value in the use cases themselves? If we're looking at our company's value, what are the value driver trees? What's the data that I need? And then additionally, it's not just about the value, but also what's the cost? And have I evaluated the different technical alternatives before I actually put that use case into production? And when we think about how do I make sure that my data and AI initiatives are kind of aligned, you've got to think about business goals, understanding your data, the value of the use cases, and the technology alternatives. I know this should be just common sense. It should be how we operate. But fundamentally, if we tie things back to our corporate goals, our business use cases, so why do we actually need to do this? Thinking about those financial, or the operating KPIs that we're trying to achieve. And then looking at those use cases. So for instance, if I'm trying to increase revenue, looking at customer, that's why I'm probably doing personalized offers or multi-channel. Reducing customer churn, that's why I'm looking at resolution analytics. Or if I'm in the manufacturing and industrial, I'm looking at production uptime of my various assets. And then I have these business goals, but what data do I need to actually perform them? Everyone's got their own internal data landscape. You augment it with third-party data. Now we're bringing other type of data. But now, in addition to just looking at that data landscape, we also have to look at, is that data honest, helpful, and harmless? And bringing that discipline into evaluating our data landscape. And then lastly, understanding the business value. How do we actually solve that problem? Because whether it's AI or any type of analytics, there's different methods that we could use. There's different levels of business value. And then actually look at that. So for me, when I think about your AI strategy and planning, fundamentally it should be part of your strategic planning process. And kind of a few key questions is to think about, as a business, what are my goals? So before we say we're going to do AI for AI's sake, what are my goals? What's my timeline? What use cases could actually support or be supported by AI? What data do you need to support those goals? Where can and should data reside? So this kind of gets into how do we look at our technology investments? Who needs access to the data? How do we govern that data? Let's also look at where can workloads be performed. Different regulations, different industry, different regulatory requirements helps us actually maybe identify where those things are. And then also looking at what are the costs and the alternatives, what risks do we need to manage, and then lastly, how would we answer those questions today, and how would we answer those questions over time? Because these things may change, and it also gets back into your technology decisions on how do I look at things that are flexible, and also making sure we're aligning our technology investments back to the business goals, the business objectives, and fundamentally, can we trust our data, and we're looking at it differently, and can I actually get the value from my technology investments? And I've got one last slide. And that is fundamentally, what are some of the capabilities as organizations that we should leverage and maybe some steps to consider. We all talk about people, process, and technology, but it's also about data. And before I mentioned a little bit about people, when we're looking at this, how do we make sure that the right people are at the table? How are we bringing in knowledge workers that understand the business problems, that understand the data, working alongside data scientists, and that we're also bringing the right industry expertise to that. And from a process perspective, let's think about data privacy up front. How are we going to be using decisions? What are the methods that we're using from an accountability perspective? What's the business value that we're planning on doing, or the business value of the investments that we're making, and also being very transparent about how we do that. And in addition to that is, let's look at our risk management and data governance process. And data governance is not something that is done in isolation. It's not owned by IT, it's not owned by our legal and compliance, and it's not also owned just by the business. It collectively has to be inherent from a cultural perspective inside of our companies. And I know it's difficult to do, but when we start to think about what's the cost of bad business decisions or using the incorrect data or doing something that's maybe not ethically correct, it's fundamentally owned by everyone in the organization, not just one component. And from a data readiness perspective, we have to make sure that we're going to be getting our return on investments. And in addition to that, are we doing things responsibly? How do we look at our process capabilities? How do we make sure from a data perspective that we're also collaborating? So when we say we're going to do a cloud environment, or maybe it's multi-cloud, or maybe it's data that's going to be sitting on-prem, how do we make sure that who knows where data is? So how do we discover? How do we manage data? And also looking at quality and who has access, because now we've got a more diverse landscape than ever before. And making sure that we unify that and looking at from a catalog perspective, but also how do we do this without replicating data? Because anytime you replicate data, you're going to end up with potentially multiple answers, which leads to why we come back and say sometimes just on data itself, we can't trust our own data. And then lastly, looking at the technology, make sure it's flexible and also that it's cost efficient. You've got to do, we all say, I need to do this fast. So what does fast mean? What's the cost of fast? And just make sure that we have consistent experiences and standardization, because that's going to tie back into our ability to make sure that we've got trustworthy data that has business value, that we're all leveraging it to make our decisions.
Thank you for the conference. As a former CFO, what would you say to the CFOs in the audience working for companies that are not currently investing in developing a data governance practice? What would your advice be for them?
I actually wrote an article for the AICPA because I've got my CPA background, and I said, if nobody else in the company will own data governance, you as a CFO need to own data governance, or at least sponsor it, because without it, your financial statements could not possibly be the most accurate. If you look at the information that's going on within the operational aspect of the business. So if nobody else in the organization will own data, I sure hope someone in the CFO or the CFO organization would step up. Because fundamentally, how do you actually attest to your financial statements?
Thank you very much for the conference. I was wondering, when a CDO comes and talks with a CEO regarding, for example, data itself, it's easier to engage with him about analytics. You will say, okay, money and return of investment. That would be like the easy path. but how do you make them engage on really important things like data quality or data governance when they hear about those concepts and you explain about them? It's like, okay, that is very nice, but I want to hear about the return of investments and the analytics again.
I actually would say, in talking with this, the CEO, you've got certain objectives that you're trying to do as an organization. You've got key performance indicators that you're trying to achieve. And actually, what are those? And within that, go back and say, so are we performing against those? Could we do better? And then it's, how do we go against root cause analysis? Why aren't we performing to that? And what role does data play into that? So breaking down, your company's value chain. How are you actually, providing value to your customers? We all talk about processes. Processes is about the movement of data. And so thinking about that context, and that for me has been the most successful way. Now, granted, when I was the CFO of an insurance company, my CEO was a former actuary, so he really understood the value of data. But it's fundamentally tying it back to the business objectives, and how are we going to use data?
Thank you for the presentation. I would like to hear your views on intellectual property, because AI models are developed using open source data, open source model, proprietary data, proprietary models. So in the end, you end up with a mixture of your own developments and other people development. So how to include intellectual property dimension in this governance model?
I think it goes back to, do you understand the source and the origin of that data? If you're using something from an open source perspective, what I actually see other organizations doing is maybe looking at them, evaluating those open source. You'll actually also start to see, there's a few organizations that are out there that are saying, in the models that they're publishing, they're actually saying there's harmful information in the data. They're actually now starting to take some of that honest, harmless, and helpful mentality to their models, because they, as a provider of the foundational models, they're actually going through and running through, is this data something that could be trusted? We saw that with a lot of the open data initiatives that were done by government. I don't know if anyone follows open data, but there for a while, there was all kinds of data. And then all of a sudden, those things got ratcheted back because people are like, we can't trust this data. So, and my aspect is, you might want to start with looking at, if you're going to be using, say, large language models, start to maybe do that internally first and then explore. Or also work with a trusted advisor. I personally I've got my own, given I was an accountant and I was also an auditor before that, and I worked in the insurance industry, I'm definitely risk adverse. So that's me personally. So I always look at those attributes first.
Hi, we were talking, a couple of friends before in the break, that some organizations like governments or even companies, the employees have a lot of resistance to change because they don't want, processes or tasks they have to be performed very quick. So what would you advise for the CDO to do in terms of the government of the data to these, all employees and also the CEO to accept and try to spend more time in taking decisions instead of taking weeks to perform some operational tasks?
That's a good question. One, I would make sure is the individuals that were maybe involved in that, in the, evaluating some of the data that might need to be used, get them involved earlier, rather than, hey, here's the model, go look at it. But as we're doing the design of models or analyzing the data, get the experts. So get your knowledge workers involved. And I think as we bring more knowledge workers, those from the business perspective into that, I've seen, at least my personal observation is that tends to work better. But also there is a sense of, data has, there's data gravity and so forth, but sometimes if we don't make decisions, that data can become worthless. So it's also kind of explaining some of those data concepts, because the more information that we have that is real time, you think about retail, you think about, healthcare, or just those where real-time information is critical. If you don't act upon it, that's just as bad as, taking action on, information that's dated. So I think sometimes it's explaining some of the concepts, and that goes back into both the ethical education, but just making sure that we have more data awareness within our business. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yes, it's answered already.
Aplauso, por favor.
Thank you.